US Lit Day 1, Postmodernism Notes. I've always wanted to be a cyborg. Ever since I was a little kid, I've wanted to have as many parts of me be bionic as possible. I'm finally getting that chance a little bit. So, anyway, Postmodernism Notes. As I said in class, this stuff is complicated, and so what I'm looking for in terms of your understanding of this, you don't need to have a perfect understanding of it. If you have kind of a big ballpark sense of idea of what's going on with this, that's just fine. Okay, some of this stuff is kind of philosophical and a little bit complicated, but I'm hopeful that with the movie we watched, Eternal Sunshine, and some of the readings we do, including the novel, using those as kind of the example, you'll have a pretty good sense of what's going on with these notes. So, number one, emphasis on impression and subjectivity. Okay, so it's more important to focus on how we see as opposed to what we see. So a good example of this is going to be the David Foster Wallace reading you do, A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again. Okay, that reading is about a cruise ship. Okay, and he gets paid to go on a cruise and kind of write about it, like a travelogue. He starts off that, and the first couple pages that you read are about that, all the things he saw and all the things he did on that, because he wasn't really whoa, my head's getting big. Anyway, he wasn't really told what he was supposed to write about for that. He just wrote. And so it isn't too many pages into it before he starts to write about not what goes on a cruise ship, but why people want to go on cruise ships in the first place. Okay, so he kind of analyzes the whole point of going on to a cruise ship instead of writing about what it's like to be on it. So he's focusing on how he sees and experiences the cruise ship instead of what he sees. He covers the what he sees because the people who... Oh, the robot side of my head keeps growing larger. I don't know what's going on with this. Anyway, the people the magazine who paid him to go and write these things didn't really tell him what they want. And so he covers all his bases and he focuses more on how he sees the cruise ship instead of what he sees on it. A number of the things we read, particularly in US Lit A, had omniscient narrators. So a narrator who would know what all the characters were thinking at any given point. Starting with modernism and into postmodernism, we really move away from the omniscient narrator because it seems pretty artificial. And so an all-knowing narrator is not valid, okay, and it stems from a feeling of isolation. When you read the last book, which you're going to start probably the end of next week, I think, looking at my schedule, it's told from 3 different points of view. So we got several main characters. We have Oscar, a kid, and then we have an old man, and we have grandmother. Sometimes they experience the same event, and yet they don't know what anyone else is thinking or seeing. Okay, so they only get and tell the story from their own viewpoint. And so what you'll see is that different characters, particularly when they're not communicating with each other, don't know what the other characters are thinking, and oftentimes misperceive what's going on, and misjudge what the other characters are thinking when they experience the same thing. Okay, so for instance, say that it was at and this is an example I'm making up, but say that they were at dinner together, having a conversation. One character could think that they were saying one thing. They could say something and think that the other character who was listening to them was getting something from what they said, a meaning or would understand what they're saying, when actually the character who is listening to them is understanding something very different than what the first character is saying. In older literature, in past time periods, you may have a narrator who would know what was going on with all the characters and be able to explain that to you. In this, because it just seems kind of artificial, it's up to the reader to draw those conclusions. Number 2, a blurring of distinctions between genres of literature. The thriller, detective story, imaginative movies mixing with real dreams, mixing with reality. So for example, if you think of like a Western, Westerns have different conventions which show up in a lot of Western movies, and especially kind of classic Western movies. Though Western movies today are moving kind of away from that. But classically, you got the good guy with the white hat, the bad guy with the black hat. You have a lot of horses, you have sometimes sheriffs, and you have gunfights and lots of horse chases, and the good guy wins in the end. And a romance novel would have, if you think of romantic movies or conventions of romantic literature, different things would show up in a lot of romantic books, particularly classically. Okay, so if you think about when you're in the grocery store and you see the covers for a book, and it's got like Fabio with like his shirt open and like rippling muscles and like his hair blowing back into the breeze, kind of like me a lot minus the muscles and the hair. Anyway, you could think of the things which typically show up in a romantic movie or romantic book. A lot of the literature and movies that you see in this time period blur genres. Okay, so if you think of Eternal Sunshine, I wouldn't say it's straight a romantic movie. It's not a comedy. It's not exactly sci-fi. It's not exactly an action movie. It's not exactly a mystery, but it's kind of got elements of all those things in it. Okay, it takes a while for you to know what's going on. There are some parts which are funny. There are some parts which are sad. There's some parts which are romantic. There is an element of science fiction or kind of philosophical ideas in it. And again, you'll see this same type of thing in Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. There are some parts which are really funny. There are some parts which are really sad. There are some parts which are very romantic. There are some. It's definitely kind of got some mystery elements to it. But all of these, I don't know that I could characterize it as what type of book it is. Okay, it's just a book. And instead of being able to say this is a romance or this is a mystery or this is a sci-fi book, ooh, my face disappeared. Now it's back. You don't really know what it is. Okay, and it just kind of takes bits and pieces from everything. Number 3, while modernism was sad for this subjectivity and fragmentation. Okay, so if you think back to modernism, if you think back to stories that you read like Soldier's Home, and when the soldier comes back from the war, everyone had been there for a long time, and no one wanted to listen to his stories, and he didn't feel like the world made sense. He didn't feel like religion made sense to him. He didn't love his family. He didn't. It just the world, as he knew it when he came back from the war, didn't fit for him anymore. He couldn't talk to anyone about it. He couldn't really move forward, and really the only thing he could do was leave his family and leave his friends. He said, I don't want to get involved with any women because I'll have to talk to them. Okay, so the world doesn't make sense anymore, and they were sad for that. If you think back to, I'm trying to think of some other examples of this off the top of my head, and I'm drawing a blank. We didn't read Jail for Prufrock, which is the other perfect example. Anyway, while moderns longed for a world that made sense, and they really, because of the World War and because of, Freud's theories of the split of the self and Einstein's theory of relativity, all these things which kind of changed the way people looked at the world, and they longed for a time that the world was more simple. Postmodern writers are happy that there was no one answer and feel there probably never was one answer to begin with, and feel that the idea that maybe there was one answer is kind of fake and artificial and not the way things are. The result of this is a lot more freedom to kind of make up the rules as you go. One book that I've talked about, and if you were in my CIS class you read, was Things They Carried. If you compare that to the soldier returning back from the war, soldier in Soldier's Home, coming back from the war didn't make sense, his life when he returned didn't make sense, and he was just basically stuck, and he was sad for a time when it did. In The Things They Carried, as I talked about, that guy coming back from Vietnam, that war didn't make sense to him. But what he did instead is it allowed him freedom to write and to create his story in a different way. And so he kind of separated into, as we've talked about, story truth and happening truth. The story he writes is told from the perspective of Tim O'Brien, who's a character. Tim O'Brien's also the writer of the story, but the Tim O'Brien in the book is not the Tim O'Brien the writer. Okay, and he would tell you things which maybe didn't actually happen to him, not factually true, but are more true than something which would be factually true. So his goal, to get you to understand, is to make you feel it in your gut, the way he felt when he was in the war. And so there's a lot more freedom, and you can kind of do more of what you want to do, and so postmodern writers tend to celebrate that idea. It allows them a lot more freedom and creativity to kind of be creative and do different, interesting things with their writing. I'm going to stop here and continue on part 2 with a different thing on my face.